Neighbors complained about the smell for 2 years. Police did nothing. Tonight, you'll walk inside the Cleveland house where 11 women vanished into silence and discover the single phone call that finally cracked open a horror hiding in plain sight on Imperial Avenue. On the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, there is a street called Imperial Avenue. For most of the last 2 decades, the people who lived there knew that something was wrong with the house at number 112205. They didn't know what. They only knew the smell, a thick, sweet, rotting smell that drifted out of the windows and clung to the curtains of the homes next door. Neighbors blamed the sausage factory across the street. The owner of that factory, Ray Cash, swore it wasn't him. He hired investigators. He cleaned his vents. The smell didn't go away, because the smell wasn't coming from sausage. It was coming from the bodies of 11 women, slowly decomposing on the 3rd floor in the basement and buried in shallow graves in the backyard of a quiet, polite ex-Marine named Anthony Sowell. To understand how a man can murder 11 women inside a single house in the middle of a major American city without anyone stopping him, you have to understand who Anthony Sowell was and who his victims were. Sowell was born in East Cleveland on August 19, 1959. He grew up in a household that, according to a niece who later testified in court, was a place of unspeakable violence. Children were beaten. Children were sexually abused. Sowell himself, by some accounts, watched a young female relative being assaulted and was eventually drawn into the cycle of abuse he had witnessed. None of this excuses what he later did. But investigators who study serial offenders almost always find a foundation like this one. A childhood where the line between love and harm was erased before the child could even name it. At 17, Sowell joined the United States Marine Corps. He served for 7 years, stationed in places like Japan and North Carolina, and was honorably discharged in 1985 as an electronics technician. To outsiders, he looked like a success story. A poor black kid from a hard neighborhood who had gotten out, served his country, and come home with a skill. But inside the Marines, his ex-wife later said, his temper had grown darker. He drank. He became controlling. The marriage didn't survive long after he came home. In 1989, just 4 years after his discharge, Sowell attacked a pregnant woman in Cleveland. He bound her with a necktie, choked her, and attempted to rape her. She survived and she testified. Sowell was convicted of attempted rape and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served every single day of that sentence, refusing parole programs that would have required him to admit guilt. In 2005, he walked out of prison a registered sex offender and moved into the upstairs apartment at 12205 Imperial Avenue, a house owned by his stepmother. That address would become one of the most notorious crime scenes in Ohio history. The neighborhood around Imperial Avenue was, and is, a place that America has largely chosen to forget. Mount Pleasant had once been a thriving working-class district. By 2005, it was hollowed out by the collapse of manufacturing, the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, and the foreclosure crisis that was about to detonate. The women who lived there, many of them, were struggling with addiction. Many had children. Many had survived abuse. They were mothers, daughters, sisters. And to a predator, they were something else. They were invisible. When a woman who uses drugs disappears in a neighborhood the police already consider a lost cause, no Amber Alert is issued. No press conference is held. Her family files a missing person report and waits, and the file gathers dust. Anthony Sowell understood this perfectly. He chose his victims with a cold, deliberate awareness of who the system would ignore. The first known victim was Crystal Dozier, a 35-year-old mother of 7 who disappeared in May 2007. Her family reported her missing immediately. Police took the report. Nothing happened. Then came Tishana Culver, 31, in June 2008. Then LaShonda Long, just 25 years old, in August 2008. Then Michelle Mason, 45, in October 2008. Tonya Carmichael, a 52-year-old grandmother, in November 2008. Kim Yvette Smith, 44, in January 2009. Imelda Hunter, 47, in April 2009. Talashia Fortson, 31, in June 2009. Janice Webb, 48, in June 2009. Diane Turner, 38, in September 2009. And Nancy Cobbs, 43, also in 2009. 11 women in just over 2 years, inside one house, on one street, in one city. The pattern Sowell used was almost mechanical. He would meet women in the neighborhood, at corner stores, at bus stops, on the street. He was, by most accounts, polite, soft-spoken. He smiled easily. He offered them a drink. He offered them drugs. He invited them up to his apartment, a place he sometimes called, with grotesque irony, his peaceful place. Once inside, he attacked. He strangled. He sometimes used a necktie, the same method he had tried to use back in 1989. He left the bodies wherever was convenient. Some were wrapped in plastic bags and pushed into crawl spaces. Some were placed on the third floor and left to decompose behind closed doors. Some he carried down to the basement. And some, including the skull of LaShonda Long, were buried in shallow holes in the backyard, a backyard visible from neighboring windows. And through all of this, the smell grew worse. Neighbors complained to the city. The city sent inspectors who blamed the sausage factory. Ray Cash, the factory owner, became so frustrated that he spent his own money trying to prove his innocence. At one point, he climbed up onto his own roof to install equipment to track odor sources. Imagine that for a moment. A businessman is climbing on his own roof with monitoring devices, while 2 doors down, a man is killing women and stacking their bodies in a house. The disconnect tells you everything about how this case was allowed to happen. There were warnings. There were so many warnings. In December 2008, a woman named Gladys Wade went to police and told them in detail that Anthony Sowell had attacked her, choked her, and tried to rape her inside his house at 12205 Imperial Avenue. She had escaped, bleeding, with marks on her neck. Detectives interviewed Sowell. He denied it. They didn't search the house. They didn't talk to neighbors. They didn't follow up. The case was dropped. Gladys Wade was a black woman from a poor neighborhood, and Sowell was a registered sex offender with a previous conviction for an almost identical attack. And still, nothing. Within months of that complaint being closed, at least 4 more women would die inside the same house she had escaped from. In April 2009, another woman who has remained anonymous in court records fled Sowell's house half naked, screaming that he had tried to kill her. Police responded. They spoke to Sowell. They left. There was no search. There was no arrest. Investigators would later say that responding officers believed the encounter was related to drug use or prostitution and didn't warrant further action. Once again, the bodies upstairs went undiscovered. What finally broke the case open had nothing to do with the missing women. It had to do with a woman who survived. On September 22, 2009, Latundra Billups was lured to Sowell's house. He attacked her, choked her until she lost consciousness, and raped her. When she came to, she somehow convinced him she wasn't going to report it. He let her leave. She walked straight to the police. This time, the report stuck. A warrant was issued. On October 29, 2009, more than 5 weeks later, officers arrived at 12205 Imperial Avenue to arrest Anthony Sowell. He wasn't home, but the smell was. And this time, the officers had a reason to go inside. What they found has been described by investigators, prosecutors, and journalists as one of the worst single-residence crime scenes in American history. 2 bodies were in the living room, partially decomposed. Another body was on the stairwell to the 3rd floor. More bodies were in the 3rd floor crawl spaces, wrapped in plastic. A human skull, sealed in a paper bag, sat inside a bucket in the basement. In the backyard, the small mound of earth that the neighbors had noticed and not understood turned out to be a grave. By the time the search was complete, 10 bodies had been recovered, with an 11th found in a freshly dug pit in the basement crawl space. Anthony Sowell was arrested on October 31, 2009, walking down a Cleveland street, calm and quiet. He didn't run, he didn't fight, he just stopped. The identification of the victims took weeks, in some cases months. Many of the bodies were too decomposed for visual identification. Forensic anthropologists from the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office had to rely on dental records, DNA samples submitted by the families who had been filing missing person reports for years, and in some cases the small personal items found near the remains. A family ring, a particular hairstyle, a scar. As each name was returned to its body, a family in Cleveland received the worst possible call. 11 calls in total. 11 families who had been told in one way or another that their loved one had probably just walked away, that she had a drug problem, that she would turn up. None of them turned up. They had all been within walking distance of home the entire time. The trial of Anthony Sowell began in June 2011 in Cuyahoga County. He pleaded not guilty to all 85 counts against him, including 11 counts of aggravated murder. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. DNA evidence linked Sowell directly to the victims. Survivors, including Gladys Wade and LaTundra Billups, took the stand and described in agonizing detail the methods Sowell had used. The forensic testimony was almost unbearable. Sowell sat at the defense table, often appearing detached, occasionally taking notes. His attorneys argued that he was mentally ill, that his childhood trauma and substance abuse should mitigate the death penalty. The jury was unconvinced. On July 22, 2011, he was found guilty on all counts of aggravated murder. On August 12, 2011, he was sentenced to death. But the verdict didn't answer the question that haunted the families and haunted Cleveland. How? How did this happen? In the aftermath of the discoveries, the city of Cleveland was forced to confront a brutal truth. A blue ribbon panel was formed to investigate the police response. Its findings were damning. Missing person reports involving the 11 victims had been mishandled, in some cases barely investigated at all. Officers had failed to recognize patterns. Sex crime detectives had been overworked and under-resourced. The 2008 complaint by Gladys Wade had been closed without basic follow-up. Sowell, as a registered sex offender, was supposed to have been monitored. He had been visited periodically by officers who never seemed to notice the smell or the women or anything else. The panel recommended sweeping reforms, including better training for missing person cases, mandatory follow-up on sex offender registry checks, and dedicated personnel for crimes against vulnerable populations. Some of those reforms were implemented, some were not. The families of the 11 women filed lawsuits against the city. Several settlements were reached, but settlements don't bring back daughters. And the question of how invisible a person has to be to America before the system simply stops looking for her, that question has never really been answered. The house at 12205 Imperial Avenue was demolished in December 2011. The neighborhood asked the city to leave the lot empty as a memorial. For years it sat untouched, a quiet rectangle of grass on a struggling street. Family members would come and place flowers or candles or small stones with the names of the victims written on them. Crystal, Tishana, Lashonda, Michelle, Tonia, Kim, Imelda, Talasha, Janice, Diane, Nancy. 11 names that for too long the world had refused to learn. Anthony Sowell never gave a full confession. He never told the families where every act of violence had taken place, or in what order, or why. In interviews from death row, he was vague, contradictory, sometimes claiming he didn't remember. Investigators believe there may have been other victims, women whose disappearances were never connected to him, women whose bodies were never recovered, women who passed through Mount Pleasant in the years between his release from prison and his arrest. We may never know how many. Sowell died in prison on February 8, 2021, of a terminal illness while still awaiting execution. He took whatever was left of the truth with him. There is a temptation, when we talk about cases like this, to focus on the killer, to map his psychology, to trace his childhood, to make a kind of dark portrait of the monster. But the real story of the Cleveland Strangler isn't Anthony Sowell. The real story is the 11 women whose names we now know, and the dozens of warnings that were ignored, and the smell that hung over Imperial Avenue for 2 full years, while a city that prided itself on being a real place looked the other way. The lesson of this case, if there is one, is that monsters don't hide in the dark. They hide in the places we've already decided not to see. If this case made you think differently about who gets searched for and who doesn't, subscribe to Dark Cases. Every week, we go deep into the stories the headlines forgot. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next investigation. And in the comments, tell me, what do you think Cleveland should have done differently?